How long could you survive? There was a scientific study that was done with airplane pilots, and they put them in a simulator and they asked them to fly their planes. And you know how they did? They did really well. When everything was good, the weather was fine, the pilots did amazingly well. Now, they changed the circumstances in the simulator. They put them in thunderstorms. They put them in difficult weather situations where they had to fly through this bad weather. You know what happened? 178 seconds was all those pilots lasted before they crashed their planes. The average was less than 3 minutes for those pilots flying through bad weather. Now you might say, well, why in the world would that be? Well, it was a special group of pilots. This group of pilots had never had instrument training. They had never flown just by their instruments alone. So what happened? In bad weather, they lost control, they lost their way, they crashed within 178 seconds. Now, as I thought about that, we are expected to fly by our instruments, especially if you think about it in a spiritual way. Now, you might say, well, how is that possible? Well, when you look at what it says in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7, it says very plainly, we are to walk by faith, not by sight. So like those pilots who flew when the weather was good, they could see everything, everything was great, they were fine. But when the weather got bad, how could they fly? They couldn't fly. They ended up crashing. And so there is a spiritual connection for us that we can't always see where life's going. And we've got to trust God. We've got to have faith in God. Even though we cannot see exactly what the outcomes may be, when we rely on God, when we trust in Him, we, in a sense, have spiritual instrument training. And when we have that kind of training, we don't just trust our eyes, we don't just trust our instincts, but we trust God. And when we put our trust in God, it doesn't matter what the weather's like, what our life is like, what the storms life may bring, we will survive. In fact, we'll be flying high because we're not dependent on us, but we're dependent on God. So let's make sure that we're flying or we're walking by faith, not just by sight. That's BT Daily. We'll see you next time.